So I got my new character.
Oh?
Yep. He is a lone wolf orphan whose parents were killed by goblins when he was young, who is seeking revenge for their death, and you will find him in a shadowy tavern as he plays the lone wolf who doesn't want to work with the team but will eventually come around.
Really?
No, I'm just kidding. And on that note, we're going to talk about turning tropes on their heads today.
Welcome to Unqualified Experts.
Not playing that character, I am Shane, your corrupt overlord.
And I'm Braden Gardner, the DM who is about to be much less annoyed.
Fair point. So, in fantasy, there are stereotypes. Or if you have gone to grad school and gotten the big money college degree, we just call them tropes. Same difference. But you've heard it. I mean, look, in movies, they look great. The lone wolf, the badass who comes in, saves the day, never has any parents, has a dark past, has a secret. You will always find him in the shadiest of shady taverns.
That sounds like Batman.
Or Aragorn. Or fill in your pick.
Pick your hero here.
Pick your backstory. It's an understandable one to fall into. I mean, it's the story of every Western hero ever, including the one I'm named after. You know, the lone gunman comes to town. But it's not really a good backstory. And I think one of the easy habits to fall into, or one of the quickest ways to torpedo a campaign, is just the lazy storytelling.
For sure. Storytelling, looking back over what's probably a little more than 15, 16 years of tabletop RPG playing at this point, the best campaigns are the ones that have a compelling story that has you as a player wanting to come back for more again and again.
Yeah, and I would even stretch this to stuff like playing the old RPG video games, where you're going to use all the tropes in the games, but even the best ones that stick out brought something extra to the table, whether it was unusual villain, players who had a more interesting backstory, flirted with the afterlife. Final Fantasy VI, the apocalypse actually happens because you fail, and then you try again. It's just, there was something different to those that made them set apart from the hundreds of RPG games that none of us remember.
For sure.
And so, sometimes just little things can make all the difference. And I think you should kick it off with how you dealt with elves, because that was a shocker to me in my first campaign.
And I'll preface, I can't take full credit for this idea. I just kind of turned it up to 11 after seeing another DM, my buddy PJ, take them in this direction. So I ran a campaign for a new gaming group that included Shane in it a few years ago. And they were traveling the world, going to various locations. They're trying to stop the horsemen of the apocalypse from ending the world, basically.
As one does.
As one does when you're supposed to be the heroes of the realm. And they make it to the island of the elves. And a number of the party were expecting the typical slow to act, quick to think, scholarly types.
Cultured, intelligent, pleasant.
Sophisticated.
You know, the fantasy adventure version of a Vulcan in Star Trek. The elves.
They did not get this. What they got instead were a species that had isolated themselves from the world and declared themselves basically the best race out of all of them. Not unlike, possibly, if you're familiar with Magic the Gathering, not unlike kind of how the Elves of Lorwyn and Morningtide operated, but with considerably less emphasis on beauty as part of that perfection.
And if you don't know about any of that like me, I would describe it as they were super xenophobic, like mountain men with the very, very scary, y'all all ain't from around here, are you, tone. Mm-hmm. Not what we were expecting from elves.
And then that was built upon with some of the other things that you might expect from elves. They are skilled in magic, but rather than using it for finesse or for the betterment of the world at large, it's used more as a cudgel, as a tool to get lesser beings to submit to them. So they had these wands of fireball, of lightning bolt, of polymorph that they would use to basically destroy or transform intruders and then do with them as they will.
They were still painfully good archers, as a character who took multiple arrows to the shoulder.
And they definitely knew how to use their forest terrain to their advantage. They definitely climbed trees. They had wizards who had some of them flying. You had a lot of the same things that you expected, but they were all built around this xenophobia instead of the scholarly, cultured look that most elves end up with.
Instead of scholarly diplomats, you had a lot of suspicious, very willing to be violent, warlike people. And to me, it was such an interesting take on elves, because I had not seen that before, whether in reading a fantasy adventure book or going on a campaign. It was a different twist that it didn't look like anybody at the table was really expecting at the time. And that just added that extra something to remember, that extra flair to a campaign that was really good.
And then the plot twist to kind of cap it all off is when they eventually survived the hellscape that the forest became.
Sorry.
They made it to the queen, who exhibited basically none of those traits. The queen was much more accepting of other races, was cultured, was basically what you expected a stereotypical elf to be, but you had to get through her entire nation to get to her.
It was a very confusing moment. And kind of delightful because of that. Kind of my favorite example of it was basically a very small surface change that I did in my campaign I ran for these guys. But the immediate reaction in the faces to the table. They had been in the swamp, which, despite their complaining, was not as bad as they say.
He's wrong, and lying to you, and also wrong. Go on.
Quite possibly 3 for 3 there. So they were looking forward to the nearest city, which I told them was the city of the dwarves. Built in a mountain, underground, so hitting all the checklist. And so, when you go to a dwarf, what do you expect? Of course they're Scottish. All dwarves are Scottish. I don't know why, but they are. It's almost like an unspoken rule. And so, the previous week, unbeknownst to them, I spent time memorizing about 30 different phrases of Outback, Aussie, Australian English. And so they're expecting some Scotsman, some Scottish voice, and they get up there, and good day, mates. You come out from the Never Never? You here for the Barbie? And they just, the looks of the room are like, wait, what? And I was like, oh, yeah, great time to be in town. Just don't eat too much or you're a chunder. And half the time I tried to figure out the Australian slang. They had no idea what it meant. And then Alon just burst out laughing because they're expecting this thick Scotch accent, and that is not what I gave them at all. Every dwarf in that city was an Aussie. And it was just, it's a little twist. It's surface level when you think about it. But I think the group would agree, it painted the city and the world and completely, it put its own little fingerprint on it. You knew right away that this was not your conventional city, this is not your conventional world. We weren't just going to fall back on the stereotypes.
And then this was built upon further by the culture of the city and how different sections acted. Like, you still got a lot of the stereotypical things from the dwarves. They lived in a mountain. They had a king who reached his station predominantly through military achievement. So you had all of that going, but that one little twist, and things kind of cascaded from there to where, they have a coliseum where New visitors are expected to brawl with the most dangerous beasts that they could successfully wrangle into the ring.
In fairness, the guards asked you if you were honored guests in between all the Aussie slaying, and half your party said yes.
In fairness, half our party is idiots.
Braden gave the party the "you didn't just say that" look. And as DM, I smiled. But yeah.
And then I buried my head in my hands and just watched the dumpster fire stroll on down the street.
What little things like that just add those nice little twists to the world that just change things up. In that case, too, another thing was, this was kind of the backwoods of the continent. So the dwarves were familiar with magic because they fought the drought. I mean, let's not change a good winning combination. But the only magic they had were from clerics, at relatively low level. Like, most of them had never seen a fireball before. And so when the sorcerer broke out some magic in the Colosseum, it was a big firework display. It was something that endeared them to the city. Then the next city they walk into, and they're celebrating the fact that this world is made of chaos magic. So there were fireballs going off in the sky just because they could. And I think that's just putting those little twists. Every place is going to be the same. Why fall to the same accent everyone uses? Why not isolate the elves and make them paranoid? And little details like that change the world and make it memorable. And that's what I mean by turning a trope on its head. Barbarian. Why not be an intellectual or a scholar who, just for the love of God, cannot control his temper?
Lots of reasons.
Fair enough. But, I mean, in a way, you're kind of talking about old Celtic culture even there. So you could work that. Since I lost a bet in Patrick's campaign, if I ever play a warlock again, my next patron has to be the Tooth Fairy. So instead of being an edgy goth, I am going to be such a peppy, upbeat person because my patron is the best ever, and we have such a good working relationship. And it's like, okay, and look, I love the Cthulhu Warlocks. There is nothing wrong with that. Great old ones all the way. But why not put a twist on it? Why not do something a little bit different, just see what happens?
Yeah, whether you're just slightly tuning one aspect or whether you're going to just focus everything about this race and culture on a single trait and then build it up to an almost ludicrous degree and then build everything else in around it.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a lot of variance that you can work with when you're turning a typical trope on its head. That's the thing about tropes. You kind of know what to expect. They're the same thing over and over with the same level of intensity and the same predictable reactions. And it doesn't really take all that much more effort as a player or as a DM to really just tune that a little bit to make it a more unique, memorable experience.
And if nothing else, it gives you a good framework to throw that curveball. Maybe your party's getting a little bit too laid back, a little bit too comfortable. Or cool, they know what to expect because they've read fantasy adventure, they've been in campaigns. Well, that's the perfect time to just twist a little bit of personality or just add a little bit of a curveball. And just see what happens. See how that affects things. And like Braden, you can do these in small ways. You can make big differences and change entire cultures. And it just creates that world or that campaign. It's going to come to life. It's going to pop. It's going to get way more interaction from the players who just don't know what to expect. Because let's face it, if you read the same book 100 times, no matter how good a story it is, it just gets boring at some point. When you read that story or that twist for the first time, you're hooked. And just creating those special moments for the players and giving them a stage to create something different and new, it's one of the best things about D&D in my opinion. Or your tabletop RPG of choice.
And it is a good opportunity to kind of help bring in players who feel like they have a hard time with creativity.
Yeah.
If they're having trouble coming up with something that they're excited to play that they feel is unique to them, this is a great way to meet them halfway and go, hey, this is how X works in my world. I know you were thinking about looking at Y. Maybe try Z to see if that works for what you want to do. Does that sound like it would be interesting to you? or if you've got players who are used to being railroaded by other DMs, or if you've got players who are used to things rolling out from a 5th edition adventure module, you can use this as an opportunity to encourage them to start making declarations about the world, to encourage them to change the way that they see their character or their NPCs behave and move forward.
You basically give them permission to go ahead and expand that view or to think in different directions. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but that's kind of the fun of it too, is just trying things out there. And the number of times I built a character with intention was A, or here's a detail that doesn't mean anything, and then by the end of the campaign, that detail that meant nothing was the defining characteristic, or I completely forgot from my starting notes that he was supposed to be A, B, or C. That just shows when you're in a good campaign and good world how your character feeds into the world and the world feeds back into the character. And I think a few small changes as DM to the various tropes, or even as a player, you know, you say warlock, everyone's assuming brooding, goth, you have a secret. If you're dressed completely in white and chatting up everyone with that high charisma, because that is your casting stat, you are going to get some looks and it's going to be glorious. So, those are some ideas. There are countless others. What's your favorite one? Was it a character? Was it a twist on the world? Was it a different type of campaign you'd run before but decide you wanted to change the ending? Please subscribe and let us know in the comments. We always love to hear those stories. If you like what you just saw, please support us by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more great gaming content.